Have you ever done this type of experiment with someone with autism?
Yes.
How did that go?
Actually, my most widely cited paper is about people with Asperger's syndrome or mild
Autism
autism.
spectrum.
And what I found with them was that if they had any inner experience at all, it was visual imagery, nothing but
Very,
visual imagery,
very powerful visual imagery.
very powerful visual imagery.
Do you have any examples?
Yeah, it's been a while now, but it was the kind of thing that well, I remember that I was sitting across the desk interviewing a person in the same kind of interviews that we had, but I deviated from my usual thing, and I said, well, I got this coffee cup here. Can you make an image of this coffee cup? And he said, yeah, I can do that. And I turned the coffee cup around on the table, and I say, well, does your image turn around on the turn around in your mind? And he said, yeah, it does. And I held up the image. I held up the coffee cup, but I hadn't really turned it around. It was the same way as it was, and
Hmm.
he was just totally pissed off at me for having tricked him basically so that his imagery didn't correspond with reality.
Yeah,
And I think that's people on the spectrum very often have temper outbursts or sensory outbursts or whatever. And,
hmm,
and so what I think about that, rightly or wrongly, what I think about that is that they have to work to have visual images. And when they get them, that's a sort of a connection to the world. And if it doesn't work out correctly, that's like the whole world goes away for them.
yeah.
And that's distressing, and they show it. And so one guy brought me in a uh, a binder, a photo album full of photographs, hundreds of photographs. And he showed it to me, and I looked through it, and the photographs, as far as I could tell, were all exactly the same thing. It was the same photograph after the same photograph after the same photograph, and it looked sort of like a fried egg, sort of like a circle with something around it. But I didn't know what I was looking at. And it turned out that these were uh, pictures of the light fixtures in the ceiling of London undergrounds. This interview took place in London. I was in London at the time while I was doing these interviews. And the guy had and the guy could look at this picture and tell you exactly what train is. They look identical to me, and he would say, well, this is in car number 417, and that one's in car 329, and this one is, that car doesn't exist anymore, and whatever. And I came to understand, rightly or wrongly, it's an N1 subject, was that this guy came to have inner experience for the first time as a older teenager riding the streetcar and looking up at the lights, and the the lights were similar enough and bright enough and captured his attention enough that he could actually see an external object for sort of like the first time, and would make like what you would say a perception. This guy had a perception of those lights, and so they were fascinating to him, and he had picture after picture after picture of these lights.
I was a aide to two autistic brothers, and one of them, he was, I think, 9 at the time. He was. Have you ever used like Google Maps or Google Street View where you can see like the actual street that you're on and click and like kind of move down it? He was able to go from his house in Syracuse, New York, all the way down to his cousin's house in Virginia just by clicking without typing anything in. I don't know how he did it, but I'm sure he took that drive one time and somehow was able to remember everything. And I've always been fascinated with how the autistic mind works. So I'm glad that you've kind of had the experience to study that as well and look at
I'm
that.
I'm pretty convinced that it is, and I would say that the the autistic folks that I was working with, some of them had no inner experience at all. So if there was any inner experience, it was visual. And I got to the place where I had become pretty convinced of this, and working for a fairly long time with this guy, and all that was present in his experience was visual imagery, and really detailed visual imagery. Like he could see a watch, and he could see the outside of the watch and the inside of the watch at the same time, and all the gears, and each like perfectly visualized or whatever, but only visual. And so I took his arm and I put him. I did a Dutch rub. You know what a Dutch rub is? You twist.
Yeah, Indian burn is what I call it.
Indian burn. Yeah,
Yeah,
you twist. You with one hand you twist, and and with the other
yeah.
hand the other way. So I did that to him, wanting to know whether. And he said, "I don't feel any pain. What I feel like is, I can tell that you're doing it, but there's no pain involved." And he says, and that reminds me of a couple of times when I was a kid. I went in my, or not as a kid, but a few months earlier, actually. He's a 20-ish-year-old guy. So a couple of months before that, he was in his flat and smelled something burning, and it was his hand. He was resting his hand. Turned out he was resting his hand on a hot plate, and his first notion of the uh, the fact that his hand was burning was the smell of it. And he said when he was a kid, when he had been a kid, this is the story that I got confused with about before, but when he had been a kid, he wanted to, his tooth fell out, and his mother said, "Put it under your pillow and you'll get a quid." And the next morning there was a quid under his pillow, and he thought that was really cool. So he took a pair of pliers and pulled out all the other's teeth and put them under his pillow, which is not something that you or I would do. And
No.
so it leads me to think, yeah, the story of visual imagery being the only kind of experience that comes together, at least for this small subset, is probably a true story.
I used to have the theory, never did any type of research on it or investigated it any further than just thinking about it. But I always felt like people with autism had this super visual experience, internal experience, that to the point where it would almost take up all their other senses. And that's kind of why their social skills lack, because most of their attention or the part of their brain is focusing on something else. I don't, yeah.
I think
Probably,
I think that's actually pretty close.
yeah. I think that it's like a neurotypical person is a little more balanced. Like if you had like a piece of pie, all the slices would be equal, where someone with autism has a much bigger slice of the pie that is a visual internal experience.
Maybe one of the world's most well-known autism spectrum people is Temple Grandin. That name mean anything to you?
Yeah, yeah, I've heard.
Temple Grandin is a professor at the University of Colorado or someplace like that, and one of the things that she does is design feedlots for cattle, and she does that by visualizing what the cow sees when the cow is doing whatever it is that the cows do. And she has a book or two called Thinking in Pictures. So her claim is that thinking is her thinking is visual. She has some theories about how visualization works, which I don't agree with, but the overall claim that there are the strongly visual people on the spectrum are likely to be strongly visual, I think that's probably true.